Well, this morning's sermon title is Unto Us a Child is Born. And coincidentally, this past week, a child was born. Elijah David McLeod was born to Pastor Ryan and Abby this past week. So we rejoice with them. I am told that mom and baby boy are healthy and happy. So be sure to rejoice with and congratulate them when you see them next. This morning is our last message in the Old Testament book of Ruth. This has been a wonderful story, and as we've been saying each week, the book of Ruth is a story of redemption that points us to the ultimate story of redemption that God would accomplish through the Lord Jesus Christ. And I think we're going to especially see that connection as we journey through our passage today. Would you pull out your Bibles with me and turn to Ruth chapter 4? Ruth chapter 4. If you need a Bible this morning, there's several Bibles provided for you there in the seat backs. And so feel free to use one of those Bibles. If you want to get to Ruth pretty quickly, you'll find the passage on page 224 of those editions, page 224. With your Bibles open then, let me start this way. You know, it's almost never worth it to take a shortcut. Have you ever noticed that? It's almost never worth it to take a shortcut. I remember traveling in the minivan with the family, all the kids in tow, Abby in the driver's and the passenger side front there, driving in our minivan with the whole family through the mountainous roads of Colorado. And as I remember the situation, on the map, it was showing us that we could get to our destination, a campsite, by going around this big mountain to our left, or we could simply go over the big mountain to our left. And, it looked like a happy zigzag trail, just going right over that mountain on the map. And so without consulting Abby, I took a little detour, a shortcut to go straight through. Little did I know that very soon thereafter, we would find ourselves in our minivan on this winding, twisty, gnarly, bumpy, Jeeps only, four-wheel drive only kind of a road. And there was no turning around. It was too narrow for that. The only way forward was forward, and white knuckles the entire way. Abby was about to kill me for this if the road didn't kill us first, right? We made it through, and now I've got this reputation. I've never lived this incident down. My kids literally describe me as, our dad, like he takes random detours into the woods for fun. The shortcut wasn't worth it, was it? Really, there's no shortcuts when it comes to things that matter. You have to take the long road when it comes to things that matter. There's no shortcuts when it comes to building a healthy marriage, for instance. There's no shortcuts to parenting, no shortcuts to building a company or building a friendship or building a reputation. Well, this morning I want you to see that there's also no shortcuts when it comes to redemption. Redemption involves paying the price to set someone free. Redemption can be a long and costly process, but it's worth it, isn't it? Our story this morning in Ruth chapter 4 highlights 3 redeemers. Okay? And each of these redeemers model for us the fullness of redemption. So, we're going to see Ruth's redeemer, then we'll look at Naomi's redeemer, and then finally, we'll take a look at our redeemer. Those 3 points. Let's take a look. First, notice Ruth's redeemer. We see this in verses 1 through 12 of the story. Now, as we dive into it, think for a moment with me about exactly where we are in this larger narrative. It's the morning after that turbulent night at the threshing floor, and I would imagine that Boaz's heart is racing. Ruth, if you remember, had risked everything to wake Boaz up in the middle of the night, and she proposes to him on the spot. He keeps thinking to himself, I can't believe it. Like, she chose me? Of all the available bachelors out there, she chose me? Of course, it's true that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer for Naomi and Ruth. You say, what's a kinsman redeemer? A kinsman redeemer is a blood relative who is perfectly positioned by the law of Moses to rescue these widows in their economic peril. A kinsman redeemer can buy Naomi's land and marry Ruth and father a son through Ruth, who would then become the legal heir of that land. And this would keep the property in the hands of Naomi's clan, and her family name would be preserved, and these widows would be provided for, and Boaz would have a lovely bride. Now, there's a little urgency to this. There's a little bit of fire to his feet. Because Naomi is about to sell her family farm to keep themselves afloat. But this is where the kinsman redeemer idea comes in. Okay, a redeemer can buy the land. A redeemer, as we said, can care for Naomi in her old age. A redeemer can marry Ruth. A redeemer can start a family. It all works together. But there's just one problem. Very importantly, there's just one problem. Boaz knows that there is another kinsman redeemer closer to Naomi than he is. Boaz knows there's another blood relative who is first in line, therefore obligated to buy Naomi's land, obligated to marry Ruth, obligated to perpetuate Naomi's family name. And Boaz knows there's no shortcuts when it comes to the redemption process. Boaz is an honorable man. He wants to honor God's law, as stipulated in Deuteronomy and as stipulated in Leviticus. This closer relative, this closer kinsman redeemer would have the first rights of refusal to the land and to Ruth. And so, can you imagine how nervous Boaz must feel as he thinks all this through? He's got to figure out how he's going to address this other man. He's got to figure out how he's going to bring up the topic and how he's going to get this man to relinquish his place in line so that Boaz can step in, buy the land, marry Ruth, and live happily ever after. But he knows there's no shortcuts here. It's all got to be done by the book, above board, according to the law, out in public, with witnesses involved. And so, Boaz hurries to the city gates. Look there with me at chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down. Why does he go to the gate? You know, in the ancient world, the city gate was like the place of legal transaction. It was like a city courthouse. Everybody made their way through the city gates, and so they were a great place to gather witnesses. They were a great place to conduct public business. The city gates were a great place to seal a deal. And Boaz sits down, not a moment to lose, waiting for the other kinsman redeemer to come through those city gates on the way out to the fields. And by the good providence of God, the man shows up. Again, chapter 4, verse 1. And behold, the redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside, and he sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." And so they sat. In this text, I want you to see Boaz has to be strategic, okay? He can't conduct this business behind closed doors. No, this conversation has to be out in the public, out in the opening. Boaz needs witnesses. So he gathers a quorum of Bethlehem elders. Everybody is seated. It's time to bring up the elephant in the room. Verse 3. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. If you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Boaz presents this man an offer that he can't refuse. Picture it. Naomi is selling her land. And remember, at this point, there is no heir to the land. Naomi's husband has died. Both of her sons have died. So whoever redeems this land is going to own the land as a part of his own estate. There'll be a little bit of cost. He'll have to take care of Naomi, but the cost is far outweighed by the yield of the land itself. So this is a great deal. The man in the story publicly affirms his desire to buy. But then Boaz pushes him right into a corner. Notice verse 5. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. You can almost see the man's countenance fall. He's just announced his desire to buy the land in front of everybody. And now he's told there's a so-called rider attached to this deal. As a redeemer, the one who buys the land must also marry the Moabite widow and attempt to bear children through her, and her son will inherit that very same land. This is a package deal, by the way. You can't have one without the other. Now, here's the problem for this man. This is an honor-shame culture, right? So everybody in this public courtroom, as it were, is thinking in terms of looking honorable before everybody that's in attendance. So he's standing there before the elders of the town. Everybody's looking at him. And he thinks to himself, look, if he buys the land, but he refuses to marry Ruth, he's going to look like a scumbag. Right? He's going to look like somebody who just is greedy and selfish and negligent. On the other hand, if he marries Ruth and produces an heir, then the land will go back to the heir and to Naomi's family tree and not to his. It won't become part of his holdings. It'll become a part of Naomi and her family's holdings at the end of the day. So the man will find himself providing for Naomi, providing for Ruth, and giving the land back. It's all cost with no benefit. And so the man is forced into a third option. He decides to step out of line and let Boaz come in and have this deal. Verse 6. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. And so the deal was done. Like a modern handshake or like signing a legal document, the man removes his sandal, which stands for authority over the land over which you walk, right? So he hands his sandal to Boaz, representing a transfer of authority. And listen, this was Boaz's plan right from the outset, wasn't it? Apparently, Boaz knows the art of the deal well before that book was ever written. It took courage. He had to trust in God. He had to obey God's law. He had to do things by the book. Everything with honor, everything above board, everything with integrity. There were no shortcuts here. But it was worth it in the end, wasn't it? It was worth it in the end. Boaz makes a public speech. He shares with everyone his ultimate intentions. He wants to redeem the land and marry Ruth and bear an heir to the land so that Naomi's family can stay attached to that land. So we read there in verse 9, then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day. I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." Can you picture the joy of this scene? It's like a modern courtroom scene today, where maybe the jury's come in, they've issued a verdict, and everybody realized that somebody that was innocent has been declared acquitted, and the whole courtroom erupts with joy. That's the kind of scene that we see here. People are praising Boaz because of his selfless acts and intentions. They see that he is caring for Naomi. He is caring for Naomi's dead husband and sons by fathering an heir to their line. And most of all, they see that Boaz is caring for Ruth. He has secured her hand in marriage, and he has done it in a way that honors God's law and honors the customs of the day. He's done everything properly. And now the people pray for rich blessing on Ruth. They pray that she would bear children abundant like the matriarchs of Israel, like Leah and Rachel and Tamar of old. May she also bear many children. And they say, "May Boaz be famous in Bethlehem." Well, we know that prayer came true, don't we? Indeed, he is famous, and so he should be, because he took the long road, didn't he? No shortcuts when it came to redeeming Ruth. He did the right thing in the right way. He redeemed Ruth by the book so that God could get all the glory in the end. It reminds us, doesn't it, of a principle that God cares not just about what we do, but how we do it. Think about that. God cares not just about what we do, but how we go about it. And Boaz, he resisted every shortcut he could have taken. Boaz resisted the temptation to act immorally with Ruth that night on the threshing floor. Boaz resisted the temptation to marry Ruth in such a way that it would neglect Naomi and the land. Boaz resisted the temptation to avoid the nearer kinsman redeemer without giving him a chance to step up to bat. No, Boaz pursued the right thing. He pursued Ruth, and he pursued her in the right way. What a lesson for us. What is God calling you to do on the one hand? And are you pursuing it in the right way on the other? I wonder, brothers and sisters, are you tempted sometimes to take shortcuts in your life? Maybe you're tempted sometimes to take shortcuts in a relationship. Maybe you're here and you desire to be married. You're single and you desire to be married. Or maybe you're in a dating relationship and you're thinking about marriage. I want you to be encouraged by the relationship here between Ruth and Boaz as they pursued one another. There were no shortcuts, were they? They did things God's way. In the process, they honored the principles of God's word. They involved family members and community in this entire decision, even as we've seen today at the city gates. And you'll notice, won't you, that Boaz and Ruth resisted sexual intimacy until they were married. They took the long road, and they received God's rich blessing because of it. As another example, maybe you're here sitting here today and you're a student. Sometimes you get a little tempted to take a shortcut when it comes to your academics. You think to yourself, what will it matter? A little cheating here, a little cheating there. Long as I get my degree in the end. Listen, it's never worth it to take those kind of shortcuts. It's always worth it to do the right thing the right way. Even if it means your grades are a little lower, it's worth it to honor God with your academics, because you can have the deep joy of knowing He is pleased with your work. You're doing it for His glory. Maybe some of us here, whether we're students or not, are tempted sometimes to take some shortcuts at work. Maybe bend the rules a bit, cook the books a little, ignore some red tape, get ahead. Here's the truth. Better to make less money and have less so-called worldly success if you have a clear conscience before God and if you know that his hands are upon your work with his blessing because you've committed to him your bottom line. Here's what Boaz shows us, I think, through this whole transaction, this convoluted, confusing, ancient Near Eastern transaction that we saw today. Here's what I think Boaz shows us here. He shows us that it's always the right time to do the right thing the right way. It's always the right time to do the right thing the right way. So I wonder, what dilemmas do you face? What choices are on your horizon this morning? Don't just do the right thing. Do it the right way. God's way. And you'll be richly blessed. Boaz is Ruth's redeemer in the story, and we can learn a lot from his example, can't we? But I want you to notice next, Naomi's redeemer. Naomi's redeemer, and we see this especially in verses 13 through 17. Look there. We continue the story. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. What a complete transformation from where Naomi started out a couple chapters before. Do you remember earlier in this story of Ruth just how dark Naomi's perspective had become? Remember when she first came into Bethlehem and her husband was dead, her sons were dead? She felt like she had no hope, no future. She said to all of her friends, "Stop calling me Naomi. That means pleasant. Call me Mara, because that means bitter." Let me remind you, just flip over a page or two. Chapter 1, verse 19. Look there again. Let's remember the old Naomi. Let's remember her initial plight. Chapter 1, verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" Don't miss this. As you read this, Naomi is blaming God for her situation there. She says, "God has dealt very bitterly with me. God has brought calamity on me. God has left me empty." She thinks she's on God's blacklist. There's no hope, she thinks. There's no future. She'll just sulk in her bitterness. "Call me Mara," she says. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been in that place? Now I want you to contrast that by flipping over and look at where Naomi is in chapter 4. In this glorious, joyful, abundant scene. In this scene in chapter 4, Naomi holds this miracle baby on her lap. And God gives her something better, we're told, than 7 sons. God had given her a daughter-in-law who loved her so well. God had provided Boaz to redeem the land and marry Ruth. God had enabled them to conceive. I mean, keep in mind, Ruth very likely was barren all those years in Moab. But now, married to Boaz, we're told there in verse 13, the Lord gave her conception and she bore a son. And it's not just any child here. Verse 14 declares that the baby is a redeemer. Do you see that word? This baby is Naomi's redeemer. This child is redeeming Naomi from her shame, redeeming Naomi from her hopelessness. Now her future is bright. This child will continue the family name. This child will restore her life and nourish her in her old age. His name will be Obed, the women declare. The name Obed means he serves. And this boy will serve Naomi. And this boy will serve all of Israel. Verse 14 says he will be renowned in Israel. Well, how true that is. You say, why is that? Well, here's a little twist in the plot. Did you notice it? Obed will be the grandfather of King David. The one and only, the famous King David. Obed will father Jesse. Jesse will father David. David will be Israel's greatest king. So Naomi is literally, in this scene, she is holding the future of Israel in her lap. Now, we've reached the end of the story, and you're just going, wow, that's where this has all been headed? This has all been headed to King David, the hope of Israel? And all of this makes us want to go back and think through the story all over again, and think through this twisting, turning plot, and all those moments in the plot where things could have been otherwise. I mean, think about it. You remember how Ruth refused to turn back to Moab, even though she had every reason to do so, but she insisted on coming all the way to Bethlehem with Naomi. Remember that? Remember how Ruth went out to glean that day and she just happened upon Boaz's field? Remember how Boaz notices Ruth and shows her compassion. Remember how risky that proposal was at the threshing floor, and yet it all worked out. Remember how those negotiations at the city gate all went right according to plan. Think about it. At any point in this story, in this tangled plot, something different could have happened. At any fork in the road, something different could have happened. And so just like one of those choose your own adventure books, where you can end up in different places, if anything in this plot line had been slightly different, we would have ended up somewhere else. And yet we see the story ends up right where God wanted it to end. God has so clearly been working providentially and sovereignly to carry out his good plan in this story. The end of the story is better than Naomi could ever have imagined. She holds on her lap the Redeemer of her family, the Redeemer of her future, and little does she realize she holds in her lap the Redeemer of the nation. She holds the grandfather of King David, and God worked all of this out perfectly right on time. You know, it's kind of like, imagine a theatrical production where Ruth, Boaz, Naomi, and all the characters in the story, they're like the characters they're performing on the stage, okay? But God is like the scriptwriter and the director. He's orchestrating, superintending everything toward his designed ends. God is working out his plan of salvation through the everyday lives of these little characters. And at this point in the story, we now get to zoom out and see what God's been doing all along. It reminds me of that 1998 animated film called Ants. Do you remember that film, Ants? It's the story of this worker ant who's pursuing the princess ant. There's all these twists and turns, and you have the ant colony defending against the termite colony, and all this stuff happens in the film, but it's at the very, very end of the film. When all of a sudden, at the very end, the camera begins to pan out. And as the camera goes out farther and farther and farther, you realize this little anthill is situated right there in Central Park in the middle of New York City. And so you have this bigger perspective now as a viewer of the film. A bigger perspective on those little adventures of all those ants. Well, in the same way here, earlier in the story, Naomi was all zoomed in on her pain and on her perceived misfortune. She couldn't understand how God could allow so much tragedy to take place. She couldn't understand or comprehend how God could work out this situation for anything good. If only she could see then what she sees now as she holds little Obed on her lap. God had been faithful indeed. God had been in the works providing a redeemer all along. In fact, let me ask you a question. Speculative question, but what do you think chapter 4 Naomi would want to say to chapter 1 Naomi? if she could give herself some advice. So what if the chapter 4 Naomi, the one that knows the end of the story, that knows all the blessing, how it's all worked out according to God's plan, what if that Naomi could get in the DeLorean and travel back in time to Naomi chapter 1, the chapter 1 version of Naomi? What would this Naomi say to that Naomi in all of her despair? Here's how I think Naomi would advise Naomi. She would say something like, listen, Naomi, I know it's hard. I know your life has shrunk in and you feel like you can't breathe from all the pain. I know you feel like God is against you. But Naomi, listen, even when we don't understand God's ways, we need to trust God's character. He is good. There's no shortcuts when it comes to the plan of God in our lives. Sometimes His path takes us through hardship and suffering and pain, but He's still good. He knows what He's doing. Trust Him, Naomi. Your Redeemer is coming. Your joy is going to be even more full as a result of this arduous journey. That's what I think Naomi would say to Naomi. And many of you in this room this morning need to hear that message too, don't you? You need to sit in this story of Naomi and let it minister to your life, because you're kind of like Naomi in chapter 1 right now. Like, life is hard for you. You're suffering from loss or from pain or from trials or disappointments or difficult decisions in your life. You are disoriented. You are tempted to give in to despair and bitterness. You want to say to your friends, well, just call me Mara. You want to give in to self-pity. You're angry with God. God, how could you fill in the blank? And if that's you this morning, listen, you need to hear this message too. When we don't understand God's ways, we have to trust His character, because He is good and He is faithful. There's no shortcuts when it comes to His plan of conforming you into the image of Christ. And God makes no mistakes. The path has many twists and turns, but you can trust your God. He is good. He is leading you. Everything in our lives, including our suffering, has meaning. And one day we'll know the end of the story, and you'll be able to look back and say, that's what God was up to. It reminds me of James chapter 1. We are told this: count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Or as the old saw goes, we may not know what the future holds, but we know the one who holds the future. And He is a good God, isn't He? He has a good plan. You can trust Him. You can walk with Him. You can depend on Him. You can rest in Him. You can cast your cares upon Him. He is your Redeemer. We've seen Ruth's Redeemer. That was Boaz. We've seen Naomi's Redeemer, who technically in the text is Obed, but of course, all around Obed is God Himself. Finally, I believe this story shows us our Redeemer, especially hinted at in verses 18 through 22. The author ends this story with a genealogy. You're like, what a letdown. How boring. Well, actually, listen, a genealogy is just a family tree. And it's a family tree that roots the characters of the story into a larger story that makes sense of their lives. And our lives as well. So look there at verse 18. We read, now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. I want you to notice some things about this genealogy at the end of our story here. I've got it represented graphically there on the screen to help us out. You'll notice, first of all, that the genealogy begins with Perez. Now, Perez was the son of Judah, who's the son of Jacob, Isaac, Abraham. So the genealogy is rooted in the patriarchs, right? The founders of the people of Israel, as it were. And then you go up from Perez, and what you find is that there are 10 people listed. And as you go up step by step, when you get to the 7th person, who is number 7 in the list, Boaz. The hero of the story, right? See, the number 7 to the Hebrew mind is a special number. It's a number that represents completeness or wholeness. God created the whole world in 7 days, right? And so something significant. Our eyes are supposed to be drawn to Boaz here. But you know, another very significant number to the Hebrew mind is the number 10. Also a number of completion. And who's the 10th in the list? Well, of course, King David. He's the 10th. That's where all of this is heading. It's heading to David. What's the message then as you look at this? The message in this genealogy is that God is fulfilling his intentions to provide for his people a king. This whole story is God's marvelous work at eventually providing a king for them. You'll remember that this whole story takes place in the time of the judges. And if you look at the last verse in the book of Judges, you read, there was a problem because Israel had no king and everybody did what was right in his own eyes. They needed a king. They needed God to give them a king. And this marvelous story is showing God's handiwork and eventually arranging everything so that you get to that Savior King, as it were. And why highlight Boaz, number 7? Well, because here again is the message. The message is that God uses the ordinary, simple, faithful life decisions of a man like Boaz to bring about his extraordinary purposes. I mean, God's just using the ordinary, faithful, simple life of Boaz to do something absolutely marvelous, absolutely extraordinary. And come to think of it, Boaz's love for God and his care for Ruth and Naomi foreshadow his greater son David, who will be a man after God's own heart, who will shepherd God's people so well. Friends, as you look at this genealogy, have you ever thought about the fact that your simple daily decisions and choices to be faithful to your God can have ramifications for your great-grandchildren? This text calls us not just to live for ourselves or our children or our children's children, but how about our great-grandchildren? Your everyday, simple, normal decisions to walk faithfully before your God can have ramifications for generation upon generation upon generation. That was certainly true of Boaz. It's true of each one of us. But you know, the significance of this genealogy doesn't just stop here. The significance of this genealogy goes out even further. Remember that the story of Ruth is situated in the story of the Old Testament. And the story of the Old Testament is situated in the story of the whole Bible. And we know that one day a child will be born in Bethlehem, and his name is David. And he will be the youngest of all of his brothers, but he will become Israel's greatest king. And one day David will be told that from his line will come another king, a king who will sit on the throne of God forever. And that child will one day be born in Bethlehem to a virgin named Mary. And that child will be all swaddled up and laid down in a manger. And his name is Jesus. Boaz is related to Jesus. It's so interesting that the genealogy of Boaz and Obed is seen once again in the Bible, but this time in the New Testament, and this time we read about Boaz and Obed in the midst of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And we find it in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 1. Rather than read that whole genealogy for you, I've got it in a condensed form here from Matthew 1. So take a look with me. And you can read the longer version this afternoon if you're really into genealogies like I am. Matthew 1, it starts with Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, the father of Jacob, the father of Judah. Several more generations go on. We get to verse 4. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. The father of Salmon was the father of Boaz. There he is, by Rahab. We'll come back to that. Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. There she is. And Obed, the father of Jesse. Jesse, the father of David the king. David was the father of Solomon, by the wife of Uriah. And Solomon, the father of Rehoboam. On it goes for many, many more generations. Verse 15, Matan, the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. A few things I want you to see here from this genealogy. You've noticed, first of all, as you look at it, it starts with Abraham, then it centers on David, and then it goes to Jesus. But then the story of Ruth is inserted in there, and it's like a key link in this chain that gets from one place to the next. These simple lives of Boaz and Ruth and so on matter. Notice an interesting detail. We learn from Matthew's genealogy that Rahab is the mother of Boaz. Isn't that interesting? Rahab was the prostitute living in the city walls when the Israelite people were coming in, and you remember that she hid those Israelite spies. Apparently, she actually was eventually enfolded into the people of God. Her son was Boaz. Maybe that's why Boaz had such a special heart for a non-Israelite outsider like Ruth, because his own mother was an outsider before God brought her in. Notice also in the genealogy that we see King David fathered Solomon, but only after stealing Uriah's wife and murdering her husband. And this reminds us that through the wreckage of sin, God still works. Notice that in the genealogy, eventually we get, of course, to Jacob and then to Joseph, who becomes the legal father of Jesus, the son of Mary, who is the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, the ultimate David, the one on whom all the promises of Israel were resting. When you read this genealogy and you start to make the connections, all of a sudden it makes you want to go back to the story of Ruth all over again and once again look at all those twists in the plots and just marvel at the fact that everything happened just right so that we could eventually get all the way to Jesus Christ. Suddenly you realize that the ordinary faithfulness of Boaz and Ruth did not just have consequences for their great-grandchildren. No, the ordinary lives of Boaz and Ruth had consequences for the whole world, because from them would come the royal line of Jesus, the Savior of the whole world. You never know the ramifications of your daily decisions, what God might be doing in the midst of it. And as it turns out, friends, the romance story of Boaz redeeming Ruth is actually a picture and a shadow of a greater romance. The greater romance coming when God would send his son Jesus to redeem his bride, his people, the church. Listen, there's no shortcuts when it came to Jesus' redemption. It was a long and costly rescue, but he came. And just like Boaz took the initiative at those city gates, you realize, don't you, Jesus took the initiative to seek and save the lost. Just like Boaz did everything that was necessary, all of it above board, in line with God's law. Even so, Jesus would take on human flesh and live a perfect life of obedience right in line with God's law. Just like Boaz came to the rescue right on time, Jesus came for us at just the right time, didn't he? Galatians 4 puts it this way. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. Just like Boaz willingly paid the full cost to redeem Ruth and Naomi, Jesus paid the full price of his own life on the cross that we might be forgiven and set free. Hear Jesus' own words on the matter. Here's how Jesus puts it in Mark 10:45. He said, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." most strikingly. Friends, just like Boaz so clearly loved Ruth with a sacrificial love, our Jesus loved us and sacrificed himself for us that we might be his own. Ephesians 5:25 says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." See, here's the thing. When you put the story of Ruth into the larger story of the whole Bible, you begin to realize that this is a story that we're inside of too, because it points to our Redeemer, the lover of our souls, Jesus Christ. Boaz, the Redeemer, points to Jesus, our Redeemer. Boaz's love for Ruth shows us Jesus' greater love for us. And listen, discovering that Jesus loves you is the greatest discovery that you could ever make in your life, because you will never find a greater love, never find a more faithful love, never find a more sacrificial love than his. It's the love of your Redeemer. If you will trust in him by faith, all of his love can be all of yours. Brothers and sisters, the message of the book of Ruth really is quite simple. You can boil this whole book down to one simple message. Jesus, your Redeemer, loves you. Have you marveled at his love recently? You know, there's nothing quite like the Christmas season to contemplate and think about, enjoy, and respond to the love of Jesus, our great Redeemer, all for you.